Want to know what the future of veterinary medicine looks like? You're about to meet someone who's building it.
I was just existing in a job and it was fine. But this allowed me to rewrite that whole story about what work means to me and what I want to take to work as well.
Welcome to Vet Life Reimagined. We are counting down the days to a new year, and I'm excited to bring some individuals whose career paths are contributing to the future of our profession. Just like today's guest, Dr. Eve Hanks. She's a veterinarian, a scientist, a founder, a CEO, and someone I am so impressed with. Eve has lived so many dimensions of veterinary medicine, from growing up inspired by James Herriot, to becoming a single mom at 19, to returning to vet school with a toddler, to mixed animal practice, to discovering research was actually not boring, to leading clinical pathology, and now founding a company called microRNA, which is at the cutting edge of epigenetics and diagnostics.
MicroRNAs are acting like the project managers of our immune system. So we've just leveled up in the game of immunity.
What makes her story especially fascinating is how all of those experiences, including leadership and even challenges of parenthood, have shaped her into someone who is now changing the future of animal health through microRNA-based diagnostics. This is truly next-level science that could transform how we improve animal health in the future, from cats to cows. So in this episode, you'll hear how Eve built a company from scientific idea to a global team, what microRNA actually are and why they might be the biggest breakthrough since we've discovered bacteria, why this technology could help us diagnose chronic disease earlier and practice more precision medicine, and Eve's incredibly honest reflections on leadership, emotional stamina, and what it really takes to grow into a person your work demands. It's part science, part career inspiration, part mindset shift. Let's get to the conversation with Dr. Eve Hanks. When did you know that you were even interested in veterinary medicine?
Oh my goodness, what a great question. So I think probably really quite young. My sister also was interested in becoming a vet and she was older than me. So that, I suppose, seeded the idea. And then we used to watch all of the James Herriot programs and it just seemed great. But I think so the vet side was one side, and I definitely thought veterinary medicine was really something that I wanted to be involved with. But then the next program that had a big influence on me was the X-Files. And so I'm showing my age, I think, with both of these now, but with the X-Files, I loved that character really of, the sort of Mulder and Scully type of idea of taking science and interrogating, these findings scientifically. So I think I was combining when I was younger the idea of being a veterinary surgeon or veterinarian with the science side. So probably that was an early clue for me that I might have ended up in the scientific part of the industry.
Yeah, that's a lot of foreshadowing too of what we start to get into. Well, and you told me too that, there was a little bit of a change of plans because you ended up having a baby around 18 years old. So how did that start to impact kind of your overall thought process of career journey? And maybe what did you find with that? Because as a newer parent too, that's
Exactly.
life-changing.
It really is life changing. I have to say, so I was 18, I was pregnant, 19, I had my daughter, and she is nearly 27 now. So it seems like a lifetime ago. But I do have to say, when you're 19, you've got lots of energy. So for all of those younger mums out there, we laugh quietly internally at some of the newer mums as they get older, because it's definitely a different type of energy for running up and down stairs, chasing toddlers, etc. But yeah, no, of course, my daughter took priority. So when I ended up going to vet school, I was in my mid-20s. So I didn't feel it was really that feasible with a baby. And particularly when you're managing that baby on your own and you have other things going on in life. So I did put it back. I think it would have been easy not to go. In all honesty, it would have been easy to say, well, that was a pipe dream. And I actually needed to go back to college and do exams I hadn't done and things like that I should have done at the end of school, but was going through a bit of a rebel phase, I imagine, at that point, as many people do. So from that point of view, yeah, I'm super proud that I stuck to my guns and went through vet school with a small child. And what it taught me, actually, amazingly, and what I noticed around my colleagues when I was at veterinary school, is that I managed to study in short periods of time, so like during a ski lesson or when my daughter was at a birthday party. And I managed to learn how to really focus deeply on something for a few hours, despite perhaps the telly playing or people asking you questions and things like that. It's actually been a really good skill. So if there are people wondering about a veterinary career and wondering about how family links in with that, it's very old fashioned. University is not set up for people with children or really families at all. And then the veterinary profession is not really very well set up, and wasn't at that time, to cater to mums and dads, particularly of younger children, particularly if you want to go on to specialize, say, do an internship and a residency. I would love that to change, because that was blocked to me as a way forward after I graduated, because I was a parent and a single parent. However, in the same breath, I think there was a lot of advantages to being that little bit more life experience and a bit more mature when I went to vet school. So the stress didn't hit me in the same way it hit some of my classmates.
Yeah, that's very good observations. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's good to know and hear that, especially as our profession is becoming more female dominated. And these are things that, we have to think about and consider as women who are very passionate about our careers, but also we adore our families too. And so we have to make some of those decisions. And I'm glad you decided to go to vet school, because I would be sad to miss everything that you're offering, which we'll get to. But then bringing back what you were thinking about when you were younger and watching James Harriet and everything, did you think that you would go into mixed animal kind of like a James Harriet, or did you kind of change what that looked like once you were in vet school and starting to get out and taking all life's into account?
That's a really good question. I was lucky in that I graduated. There was still mixed practice jobs around, large animal equine, and then a mix of small, large, and equine at one point as well. So I really enjoyed that. I did want to do that. I really, really thought I wanted to do that, like 100%. And I didn't find the research side as interesting when I was at university. Looking back, reflecting back again for any students, there was a level of naivety there, because I think everything at vet school was so loaded towards clinical work, because it's essentially what you're prepared to do when you go out. Everything was so loaded towards clinical work that in actual fact, there wasn't a lot of thought given to the research. And it seemed like if for some reason you weren't good enough to be a clinical vet, you could go into research. That was the impression I got when I was at vet school. Which, of course, now, with a veterinary passport, as we say, a degree such as that, we understand, I think, more, my classmates and I, now that we're further in our careers, we understand about specialisms. We understand you can work in epidemiology, public health, you can, do industry work, you can do research, you can be an entrepreneur, for example. So I think I didn't see the passport, I just saw the ticket towards clinical practice. And I was in clinical practice for a while, and did a mixture. I did small emergency, farm, equine, and some telehealth actually towards the end. So I did that for about 12 years, and I enjoyed it very much. Some days better than others. I'm sure every veterinarian would be nodding along to that. So some days definitely better than others, but I did overall enjoy it. The problem was I felt like after the initial learning curves, I maybe just wasn't making the progress in my career that I'd expected. And again, it's that idea where you're perhaps a little bit veterinary assistant, working in that veterinary job, but there's not the opportunity to own a practice, or there's not the opportunity, perhaps without a big change in life anyway, to launch your own practice. So at that point, I was questioning, well, what the next step here?
And I know you had mentioned doing a specialty is really hard as a single mom, because it is intense. There's very little pay, time consuming. And so that can be pretty intimidating. And, there are other things you can do. So I'm glad you were able to find that? And actually, that should be a question. Like, I know you decide to do a PhD in immunology. So, how did you discover, oh, like this is an option? And what intrigued you about it that you wanted to go down that path?
So I didn't get the first PhD that I went for. And oddly, the person who got it is now Rob, my co-founder.
Oh,
So sometimes life does things, that you don't
Circles.
expect. So there was initially a PhD more in equine molecular diagnostics that I thought, oh, that sounds great. And it was great. I saw Rob do it. He really enjoyed it. And so we both applied. I didn't know Rob before. We both applied for that one. And at the end, I didn't get that PhD, but the examining committee, if you like, the decision makers said, there is another one and we do like you. So would you apply for that one? So I thought, okay, that sounds great. So at the same time, Rob and I started our PhDs. Mine ended up being more immunology and his was more on the molecular diagnostics side. So it turned out very well. But the actual idea of doing a PhD had come from me looking for the next step, really. So, and I did a certificate in medicine when I was in practice. So did that alongside practice as opposed to a specialist. It was an advanced veterinary practice certificate. And when I was doing that, I realized that I really missed the cutting edge part, the science, the new way we can apply some of these new findings, like just learning, reading papers, reviewing, critiquing things that were happening in the overall industry had really reminded me that I did enjoy that part of the job. And that's what was missing. So naturally, I thought I've got to carry on with research and started to look at PhDs.
Yeah. And I still think it's funny. You told me that when you were in vet school, you thought research was boring. And little did you know that, oh, it is actually interesting and the right context. So yeah, so you start to say, oh, it sounds really fun to be kind of on the cutting edge of what's new. And coming into that, though, with a clinical background, I think is also really unique because you're able to be on the cutting edge, but also understand, like, practically, like, how can we do something with this? Because I think sometimes the research kind of just is left into this journal that is, people don't have time to read. And it's not like carried forward where we can actually implement that into, why we're in veterinary medicine. So what were you discovering in your PhD program? And it sounds like maybe you and your co-founder maybe shared some of these things and got excited together. But like, how did that go forward and to eventually getting to starting a whole company?
Yeah, you're totally right. Applied science is what I'm really passionate about. So I have to say during my PhD, I was just PhD focused. It takes a lot of your brain and a lot of your life. And I loved it in the sense that I would lie awake at night thinking about how I could adjust this experiment or that experiment to get things to work. It's both good and bad, but it definitely encroached into all areas of my life. And so I didn't really have any idea that I wanted to do innovation at that point. I met microRNAs, which is what the innovation is based in, and I understood them and I thought they were important. And then that was it. However, after my PhD, I took a job as a clinical pathologist. So exactly as you're describing there, the clinical knowledge, plus at that point then the immunology research, and then the last string to the bow, if you like, last part of that triangle was when I was working then analyzing diagnostics, working with the team at the pathology lab to understand disease outbreaks, the epidemiology side, the failings in some of our diagnostics, the difficulties in interpreting even something as simple as a blood smear or biopsy or a blood test. It suddenly dawned on me that we therefore could do something more. And of course, into that, why are diagnostics not better than this gap, which I was starting to understand, I dropped in the idea of microRNAs. So that's where that came from. Now, initially, you're right that Rob had been doing his PhD there, and we definitely batted about some ideas. He was obviously innovative at the time. So as microRNA, after I'd launched it, and then I started to grow and gather some traction, a couple of years in, I gave Rob a call. So that was how that happened. There was a few more steps, but we weren't quite as visionary as you made it sound. A little bit incomplete.
Yes. If we don't mind, let's step back and let's talk a little bit more about microRNA because this is still fairly new to a lot of people. So, do you mind sharing a little bit about how you personally discovered it and just kind of what it is? Because I've heard you describe it really well.
Thank you. So microRNAs are tiny pieces of RNA. They're non-coding. And when I was at university, it used to be involved in that part of the nucleotide space that people call junk DNA or junk RNA. So obviously, perhaps slightly naively now, we look back on that, but because it wasn't like messenger RNA, it didn't make protein. It was considered to be some sort of leftover junk. So obviously things in that field started to emerge. And in the last perhaps 30 years now, microRNAs have been discovered. So the last 30 years, these guys are so important. It's just not that long ago. And when they were discovered, it was thought initially that they were in this, I think it's a free living worm they were found in, cousin of a parasite that's often studied in labs in order to understand things like genetics, etc. Because they're very easy to engineer. So the microRNAs were discovered there and not studied out with that realm really for several years until someone had the bright idea to have a look to see if they're elsewhere. And it turns out they are. So microRNAs now it's known they're found in viruses, fungus, bacteria, all mammals that have been looked at, plants, for example. So they're literally ubiquitous. We also share a common ancestor. So microRNAs in mammals evolved around 500 million years ago. And so what that means is that we have conserved microRNAs. So the microRNAs in my body are the same as a cow or a horse or a dog or a cat. Excellent news for researchers who would like to look at different species. So that's really interesting. And then the scientists who really first started working with microRNAs in that discovery phase won the Nobel Prize for their discovery last year, at the end of last year. So like literally, this is brand new. Like it's it's very akin to the first time we discovered bacteria as a society, because it's literally changed thinking to that level where people are like, oh, I see why cancer appears. Oh, I can see why cancer's regressed. Oh, I understand why this inflammation has happened, in one COVID patient and not in another. Or, for example, there are microRNAs working in all different types of development. So congenital problems can be attributed in a lot of cases to microRNAs alongside a variety of different responses to infectious disease, but also non-infectious chronic diseases, pregnancy, all of that is microRNA driven. And so really what that boils down to is that microRNAs are acting like the project managers of our immune system. So we've just leveled up in the game of immunity. We've leveled up and we can see the level above what we previously understood. And we understand now that microRNAs can act on lots of different pathways. So they can turn genes on and off. And often one microRNA can do that for a variety of genes. They also can silence messenger RNA by binding it and breaking it down in some other mechanisms. And then they also act on their own molecular pathways and act as their own messengers. So they're great to eavesdrop a little bit on the conversation that the body is having between itself. The other thing that's super interesting is that if you remember, they're in bacteria, plants, all mammals. Everything we eat is full of microRNAs. And therefore, everything in our intestinal microbiome, on our skin that we wash with, etc., is all microRNAs as well. So we don't just have our own microRNAs acting on us as a host, but we have the microRNAs that we ingest that live in our intestines, for example, interacting with us as a host and creating their own microRNAs that can make their way up to, for example, our brain. So we understand now that unexpected things like chronic pain, depression, anxiety, suicide, etc., can actually all also be driven by microRNAs. And it could be one of the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that allows us to understand more holistically the system that we live in, as opposed to thinking of us as a body with some bacteria in our gut, instead understanding that whole system is in constant communication. And that's super fascinating as well. So there's lots of emerging areas of science that allow us to really consider aspects of medicine that need to be put in place to really deal with some of the chronic diseases we see in our human and animal population today.
So is this basically part of the epigenetics that people talk about?
That's right. It's
Okay.
epigenetics. So genetics, of course, being your genes that you're born with, can't do much about that. But of course, you're born with a variety of genes that may make you or me more susceptible to a disease, let's say heart disease, for example. And that's true also of dogs, cats, etc. So we may have a predisposition to a disease, to our genetic imprint that we can't change at this point in time. That science is also advancing, but we can't really change that just now. However, what's actually expressed, what actually happens is then down to the microRNAs and other markers in that epigenetic space. So your genes aren't just randomly all expressing at all times. They will express in relation to a variety of things. So how much are you under stress? What's your environment like? Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you stay up too late? Do you need medications, etc.? All of that has an effect on what genes, it's not what genes we express at what time, but very simply, we could say what genes are on and what genes are off.
You already kind of alluded to a question that I would naturally have as a nutritionist. I was like, does what we eat also affect that? And that's actually, so I've heard about epigenetics, at that like very superficial level of this is the part that turns genes on and off. I need that much. And now you're kind of like defining it where you're getting to the point where, okay, now we know how to backtrack and work with these specific elements to impact the epigenetics. And I know that in human health, they've looked at epigenetics and nutrition. And then what you talked about on the innovation podcast was about heart disease in men, and something about you can tell that if a man has a heart attack, the likelihood of them dying. I think, did I get that right? Something
Right.
like that?
I personally can't tell,
Well,
but no, not quite. I'm not quite as good as that, but doctors that are working in microRNA research can tell. So what you're touching on there is the idea of epigenetics as prediction. So we have an element of prediction in genetics, don't we? Because again, we can say, right, you've got a father, for example, who has brown eyes, a mother who has blue eyes. We know we can predict the color of the eyes of that infant, for example. So there's genetic prediction is possible, but it's by no means foolproof. And there have been many breeding programs run, farms are a perfect place to look for that. These breeding programs that were run to have a particular type of muscle or height or characteristic in a lamb or calf or a foal, for example. And sometimes it happened, but not always. And it was quite hard to understand, well, why not? Because we've got this blueprint and this blueprint. So why are we not getting a mix of the two? And so that's where epigenetics really started to be explored in a bit more detail around that prediction side, was perhaps for the breeding side of things, but it turns out it's way more powerful than that. So there are certain profiles of microRNAs that will be apparent before death, and they can be attributed to death by a particular cause. Now, obviously, there are inflammatory microRNAs that might be in the middle of a rising in a death, a sort of old age death or something like that. But there's two that stick out for me. So the first, like you say, is in heart disease. When before really the heart attack has occurred, there are microRNAs that elevate that suggest that heart attack will be fatal. And we don't even know the heart attack is going to happen yet. So like you can start to say to someone, you're going to have a heart attack and you're going to die from it. So it's like predictive of death, or ideally you're not going to die from it. So it's predictive of death. The other one that I find astounding, and again, a lot more research to go into this area, but there are 2 or 3 microRNAs that elevate in a human being in 24 hours before they die from suicide. So yeah, it's a big one. So, again, it's what level of system are we going to discover here? How deep can we dig here? And ethically, do we want to predict death? Who knows? But actually, if we can see those events or end stage moments coming, then can we in some way control that, either using antisense microRNAs, there's an actual medication to avoid that event, or giving the good microRNAs. Again, we're very far from understanding what's good and bad, but giving good microRNAs that might counteract some of those effects, stop that cancer, stop that death, stop that clot in a cat with HCM, stop that heart failure in a dog with MMPD. So there's a lot of things that can be done with microRNAs, but it's a very watch this space because we don't really know in the scientific field what happens if you give antisense microRNAs, and particularly not long term. So one of probably the first modifications could be trying to manipulate the microRNA pattern through diet, actually, as you mentioned. So a really interesting area. But there's a lot of work just now in therapeutics on the human side to treat things like cancer in particular, trying to fight against some of those oncomers, so those oncology microRNAs which are causing cancer, and allow regression. Super interesting.
Yeah. Sounds like a lot more to learn and understand. How did you decide which direction you were going to go with this knowledge, and especially for animals? And, what have you discovered so far? I think the company, MiRNA, is about 6 years old. So, yeah, how did you decide your direction? And when it comes to the nitty gritty of diagnostics, I happen to know it's diagnostics, what have you started to work on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're right. The first decision there is, do we look at microRNAs from a therapeutic or a diagnostic point of view? And diagnostics is going to be quicker as an applied science to actually take into a clinic. So we chose that, or I chose diagnostics. And really the reason for that, apart from it being quicker, is that therapeutics, the data that we need as a community for therapeutics can also come from diagnostics, because in diagnostics, we map the disease, which is almost like the baseline data then for the therapeutics. So the diagnostics side of things, we don't actually need at microRNA to know what each microRNA that we work with in diagnostic way, what it's actually doing. We just need to know that it's consistently there in a disease or a health state. So that's great. So that was the first thing. And we obviously want to know what they're doing, but it's not necessary for us to 100% understand each molecular pathway of that microRNA and friends that are on our microRNA panels. So the next thing we had to do was decide where they might be most useful. And I found personally in practice, it was really frustrating when I was working with chronic disease in cats and dogs. For example, you hear a heart murmur in a dog and you just say, let's wait and see. Maybe you can't do scans, probably MMVD, etc. Or you have a larger dog who maybe has DCM, but you've got no idea. So, they have a dilated cardiomyopathy and collapse, and then that's first you know of it. And similarly with cats with chronic heart disease around things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where they can't even just die, and I just thought that was such a failing of diagnostics. But there was no obvious pathway for some of these otherwise healthy animals to be routinely scanned all of the time. So that seemed like a big gap. And so that led us initially down chronic and cardio disease, which turned into cardiovascular disease, which turned into chronic disease of all sorts. So we also work with osteoarthritis, for example, kidney disease. We do some work in cancer. We're working on anxiety in dogs, which is great. And we're also looking at different types of sampling in cats and dogs. So urine sampling and blood sampling, for example. So trying to make that whole thing really flexible. So the idea is that some of those really frustrating gaps where early diagnosis would be amazing, and we currently don't have a blood sample for it, that's where we targeted first, or a urine sample. And then I actually didn't want to just do companion animals. So we definitely also have our production animal side, which we talk about slightly less because a lot of podcasts and a lot of the visibility work that we do is focused at the pet space because it tends to be where people are more interested. But actually, for me, production animal is as valid and as important in terms of research. One of our mission and aims around microRNAs and diagnostics in general was to diagnose early disease so we can manage it better. And that absolutely makes sense on farm as much as it does in clinic. So on farm, we have a problem with endemic disease, which really means that we're dealing with diseases we can't eradicate that are constantly sapping the welfare, the productivity, and the economics on a farm, plus at the same time adding to greenhouse gas emissions, for example, per kilo of meat and per litre of milk. And that's also unacceptable diagnostically, because with things like microRNAs, what we can do is diagnose that disease earlier and then manage it better so that we reduce those rates of prevalence and hopefully eradicate certain diseases as we go forward. So we're working with Johne's disease in cattle, which is the same as Crohn's disease in humans, and we're working with tuberculosis. So two big targets in the cattle side. But we have other plans as well to work with some of the other chronic endemic diseases that affect the sector.
That's fascinating. So you're saying you're looking at opportunities where there's a gap in diagnosis. I get that. Will this also be something like spectrum of care, is a big hot topic right now. Is this something that you foresee being financially also option, or do you think this is going to be expensive to start out with? Like, just from that perspective, as we're starting to get a little bit more into the application of this, what can we expect from that when we're trying to talk with whether it's a pet owner or a farmer? How is that going to be a part of this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And not to be held to any of the price discussion.
You don't have to name an exact price.
It depends on your geography. And no, you're totally right. So this is supposed to be applicable. And so it's a mid-range test for like cost wise for our small animals. So for example, if you want to screen, let's just, throw a use case together. If you want to screen a slightly older cat pre-anesthetic to make sure there's not HCM there, it's going to cost you about the same as a pro-BMP test. But you're going to see early disease. And then as there's two aspects of the technology, if that's positive, as we move forward with our results and with our data, because we use artificial intelligence and data modeling to superpower these results and to build in that predictive aspect that we talked about earlier. So as we move forward into that part of the work, then we would be able to take a positive test forward for further testing to then build in prediction about what stage is it, how likely a clot's going to occur, how likely is it that this cat could suffer a sudden death, for example. So that could be then an add-on cost, of course. But again, it's still super accessible. Like, it's not prohibitive. And then on the farm side, it's about the same as an ELISA test for Johne's disease, again, so just very comparable to what's out there in the market. But again, if there's a positive reading for Johne's or TB, further work can be done, particularly in Johne, because predicting whether that member of the herd, that cow, is going to go ahead to have clinically expressed Johne's compared to subclinical and not really that relevant Johne's can be really useful information for herd management. So there's a variety of layers is the answer to the question. It's a bit complex. It's a variety of layers. There's like a sort of mega meal deal, if you like. You get all of the predictions. And then there's like a Diet Coke version, which is just the screening and wellness test. But both, if you imagine the price range of tests being from very high to very low, both are sitting in a comfortable place within that sort of quartile 2, quartile 3 of testing.
And is this something that a veterinarian in private practice, general practice, could be able to do?
Yes, targeted completely for generalists at this point. So generalists are usually our early disease diagnosers. And, absolutely, it's tough in practice to do that and to do it as economically and as quickly as possible. And to screen, so wellness testing, all of that, health checks, etc. So that's where the test is aimed. As the prediction aspect builds in more and that becomes more reliable, as you imagine, we need lots and lots of data. So we've got 48,000 data points in our data models at the moment, which is amazing, and from all of our amazing collaborators and sample collectors that have got us to this point. But as that database builds and we're more sure of the prediction side, then of course it becomes more relevant as well for specialists, because it's the sort of test you could run alongside a biopsy or a heart scan or if you're looking at a scope for joint disease, etc. So all of that can be built in for our cardiologists, nephrologists, and oncologists going forward. But we're not quite there yet. That's going to take maybe another year to a year and a half to put together fully.
Yeah. Well, and thank you. You built on kind of where I was going with this is, this is super exciting. And in this podcast, a lot of what this is about is talking about the possibilities in careers in veterinary medicine too. So as this sounds a little sci-fi almost that we're getting to these levels, what's the impact for the professionals? Do you see this creating new jobs and potentially career paths?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there are a variety of things that generally artificial intelligence, big data, all of which we're part of, and then innovative models around things like diagnostics and therapeutics are going to be bringing to the table. And people say, where do you think this might be in 10 years? But no, like 1, 2 years. This is changing a lot. And we've already seen in practice that now in clinic, there's a variety of AI tools being used, like pathology, for example. ChatGPT is everywhere now. I know that a lot of people lean on ChatGPT to remind themselves of an anesthetic protocol, for a certain size of dog, for example. So that type of thing. So it's going to become more prevalent in hospitals and in clinics and on farm. And we're riding that wave a little bit. So I won't claim to create the jobs or change the behavior and practice just with what we're doing. But as that's naturally changing with everything that's happening and embracement of these new technologies and the ability to deliver better care at the right time to our patients, which is essentially the point, and the impact that we want to have, that as we get longer living, healthier health spans, longer living lifespans, of course, for our pets, due to these advancements, I think there is creation of jobs there. I think there's not just creation of jobs, but creation of job satisfaction, of being able to do what we actually train to do because we're not constantly guessing. We're able to have the facts at our fingertips. And when that moves forward as precision medicine, where we will know from a simple diagnostic test, and once all this is combined and the data we hold on a pet, what treatment to use, when to start it, what the outlook is, and what the prognosis is, genuinely, I think the owners are just going to lose that worry that comes, with pet ownership. The vets aren't going to second guess themselves all of the time because it's precision medicine. Data is there. And then we're actually going to be able to do slightly more advanced levels of medicine, even in generalist practice. So I hope this is going to elevate really the job for everybody.
And going back more towards your particular career path and job, how has this impacted you? I got off on a nerdy sidetrack. You start this company, you're working with partners, but what are you experiencing yourself personally through all this? What have been some of the challenges, but also some of the interesting opportunities?
Yeah, it's always difficult because it depends. I think it's such a different day every day. It almost depends when you ask that. With this and it's like, well, today's all right. But it's, I think for me, the growth that I was seeking, as I mentioned, when I was in practice, I felt like it definitely had so many wonderful colleagues and so many great learning moments. But that lifelong learning wasn't there for me. Sure, you're going to get a shock every now and again with an emergency you've never seen, but things can get a little bit routine. So for me, this flipped that completely on its head. And the amount of learning that goes on when you're in a startup position, a leadership position, and at the cutting edge of science, I mean, it's insane. I learn something new about every hour, never mind every day. So it's wonderful. But for me, there was a couple of big transitions. So the first one was I was a scientific founder, so dreaded by every venture capital fund, worldwide. So I was a scientific founder, science first. I wasn't doing this, and still I'm not really doing this for the financial return. I was doing this to apply the science. So it's, for me, a scientific project that got a little bit out of hand. But now, obviously, we have raised money quite a few times. We've got 35 people working with us in 10 different countries. We've got literally close to 100 collaborators or partners in different areas and places working with us, in terms of everything from data, samples, processes, right through to the end delivery of a diagnostic. And from that point of view, I had to move from being a scientific founder to being the CEO. And that professional development path was way harder than I had signed up for. Just the emotions of that, the changing who you think you are, what you think you can do. Like, no comfort zone existed for many years. And of course, the thing is, you're doing a lot of this while you're working another job, because at the start of a startup, you don't have a wage. Like, someone's there to pay you. This is just some crazy idea that you've had in your bedroom one time, and written in a notebook. So you've got to make it into something before you can actually join the company. So I think I was like staff member number 5 or something by the time I was employed. So I think that I didn't realize. I thought you raised investment, then sort of got on with it, but you have to do a lot before you get anywhere near investment or grants, etc. So that was a big learner for me. And then you have to change and be the best version of leader that you can, because you're then genuinely in a CEO position and you're not in a founder position. You are, but like the two have changed. So I'm just finishing off my MBA. So I think that's been a really important journey for me. So just professionally putting that degree in place so that I know that I'm working with the business and the science and the people knowledge by them. So that's been really good. And then personally, for me, I've taken this opportunity really to explore a little bit about what I wanted in life. My daughter has grown up, of course. I moved house, I got counselors, thing ever. Everybody should do that. And I started to invest in me. So there is an element of people talk about resilience when you are a startup founder. They're not wrong. But resilience isn't something you're born with. Resilience, I think for me, certainly, is something that it's almost like building stamina. It's like emotional stamina, as opposed to resilience sounds a little bit like you just get up, get knocked down, get up, get knocked down. It's not really how it works. I think it's emotional stamina to ride those difficult times of doubt, of rejections, of all of that comes with trying to raise money, trying to sell an idea or a dream, if you like, partnerships that don't work out, whatever it might be. And I think the stamina that comes with that is something you can practice. But to practice that, you need the self-care. Like you need to actually give yourself a little bit in the tank before you go to work every day. So I think from that point of view, something I'd never really considered was that self-care was actually the key to the productivity that we find, or I find, that I have locked up, if you like. So that was a complete change. Before I was just, running every day, not really thinking, not really analyzing, not really taking joy in my work, if you like. I was just existing in a job and it was fine. But this allowed me to rewrite that whole story about what work means to me and what I want to take to work as well.
That is probably something most people just needed to hear. So thank you for sharing that. And now, one of the things you graciously shared with me, and as I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. You had such a desire for growth and learning. At the same time, failure, or the idea of failure, maybe even to start with, is really terrifying. And you shared that this is one of the things that you've really had to work on, which is extremely common, one in life, but especially in a startup. Like, because that's just part of startups, right? Like you fail fast, you learn, and you go. And so I think this is an interesting, almost paradox, right? Like this need for learning, but along with learning, it is like failure. Like failure is how we learn most of the time. So do you mind sharing a little bit more about that? Because I think a lot of people relate to this. So if you don't mind, again, asking for a little vulnerability, but sharing a little bit of your journey here.
No, of course. No, I'm really passionate about this. One of the other roles I have now is I coach other startup businesses through an initiative that the University of Surrey run. And this is a matter that comes up quite often, actually. And it's those first 1 to 3 years where this really bites, if you like. But and it's not but, it's just hard to go through. There's no but. Sometimes it can just be difficult. You don't have to say, but positively. And it is just difficult, that part. I think the emotional stamina comes from having gone through that part though also. And what kind of happens after a little while is, for me, is that I realized that what I was worried about happening was always worse than what happened. Now, we can say that about any part of life, of course, but in particular in business, the moment someone started relying on me and my ideas for a wage, that was like every person we took on was like on my shoulders, if you like. If you imagine that, then the failure, it's not about me losing face. It was never really a fear that I had, well, everybody has, but that I felt personally would impact me heavily in my life. It wasn't so much that, it was more, I've got these members of staff with families and kids and dreams and lives and holidays they're paying for and mortgages. And this is relying on me. And I felt very much like that. So every decision you take gives you that shoot of adrenaline, that moment of fear, because what happens if this doesn't go right? And of course, if you leave any questions such as that to ruminate in your brain, then you're going to get all sorts of scenarios that aren't necessarily going to be the most positive. However, luckily for me, I'm naturally optimistic, so I can see that things could go wrong, but I feel that it's more likely that things are going to go well. And what you actually change, I was talking to a friend this morning on a walk, actually, so I'll share that conversation because I think that's useful. What actually changes is you move from a scarcity mindset, and perhaps you've heard about this, to more of an abundance mindset. And that's what you're describing, where you fail fast and then you get on with it in some other way. Every failure, oh, it's so cliche, but every time you fail, there is another opportunity. It's that idea where it's not the scarcity. I had an idea, it failed, I can't do anything else with it. I tried to raise money, they said, no, I'm stuck. Or I tried for this partnership, it didn't come off, I got nowhere to go. That scarcity mindset, actually, you're right, you can't do anymore. But if you go with that abundance idea, I tried to raise money with these people. They said, not yet. So I need to try to find someone more linked to this aspect of the sector. Or maybe I need to have more angels on board before I get VC money or whatever it could be. So it's always having that idea that it's going to work out. There's going to be the opportunity there. And if this partnership isn't ready to unlock yet, well, that's great because these resources can go here towards this partnership. So that change from scarcity where I was at first, where I just followed one simple path and then got a no or a yes. Sometimes obviously also got a yes, it was great. But, and got a no, I started to realize that that path zigzags everywhere and there's all sorts of tangents that come off of it. And that the no's are still no's and there's still that emotional response to a no, but that the no's themselves often allow you to take that tangential path and find something that would have been better actually overall. So yeah, I don't know. There's no answer to failure. We all fear it. Like you say, it's not a pleasant feeling. But I think scarcity versus abundance can help or certainly help me to ease some of that.
Yeah. And I think there's a little bit of experience in it too. I think I kind of caught it too when you were talking about it. I think when you fail once and you realized I didn't die and there's something else came around, it's still hard, but it kind of builds that abundance mindset. It's like, okay, we've done this before. And so being around other people with experience, so that's so wonderful of you to be there to support other startups. So you can hear other people say, been there, it stinks. But there is that, you never know what might be around the corner. So now's not the time to stop or get stuck. It's to keep looking. Well, our time is almost gone. So before we have to leave, if people want to follow more about you and microRNA, where can we send people to follow up?
I love the LinkedIn community. So definitely I got a lot out of LinkedIn and always love to hear from people, messages, etc. I try to respond to that. And we post what we're doing as a team. So that's always handy. And then in the next few months, we should have a lovely revamped website. So I loved our old website too. So I was very heavily involved in that, but we're getting a bit more professional. So there's going to be, if it's interesting, things like scientific papers that we're publishing, or conferences we're speaking in, or presentations, videos about the company, then the website's great for that. So that's probably the two main areas. And generally, as we were just saying, that things like normal conference life, like actually arriving at veterinary conferences, I'm often there. So it's always great to meet people in person as well.
Sounds good. We were just talking about VMX. So if anybody's headed to VMX, look up microRNA and reach
Let's
out.
do it.
So
Yeah.
awesome. Well, the question I always love to end on is, what is something you're really grateful for right now? Just the first thing that comes up to your mind.
The walk I had with my friend this morning. So honestly, my friends, my family, my colleagues, just that human interaction to keep you sane. Yeah, love that. So, so, so great.